Welcome to The Explainer. So, today we're looking at arguably one of the most famous dates in world history, 1776. But we're coming at it from a totally different angle. We usually just focus on the battles, right? Or the ringing bells of liberty. But what happened next? Well, today we're going to explore the incredibly chaotic global chain reaction that immediately followed the American Revolution. We're talking about how a single conflict completely reshaped the world order, sparked brand new revolutions, and honestly left us with this really complex legacy that we're literally still trying to figure out today. We all know the classic story of 1776, right? It's the ultimate story of independence. 13 scrappy colonies breaking away from this massive, mighty empire to forge their own path. But I really want to challenge what you think you know about the aftermath of the revolution. Once the ink was actually dry on that declaration, what was the immediate next step? Well, the answer isn't just about, building a nation from scratch. It was actually about pure survival on a really hostile global stage. And the strategies the founders used, they set off a shockwave that touched almost every single continent. Okay, let's dive into this with Section 1, a Declaration of Interdependence. Writing near the end of his life, Thomas Jefferson actually described the Declaration of Independence as, quote, an instrument pregnant with our own and the fate of the world. Now, when Jefferson and the Continental Congress drafted this thing, they weren't just writing up some lofty philosophical statement for themselves. No, they were actually writing a diplomatic plea. It was addressed directly to a candid world. See, they absolutely knew they couldn't defeat the British Empire alone. There was no way. They desperately needed foreign alliances. They needed money. And they really, really needed gunpowder, specifically from France. So, to actually get that foreign help, they had to legally change their status. Modern historians point out something super fascinating here. The core goal of 1776 was actually international interdependence. Think about it. No European power was going to sign a treaty with a bunch of treasonous rebels, right? But by issuing a formal declaration, they officially transitioned from quote-unquote rebellious subjects to recognized belligerents. It was this brilliant, calculated legal tool to basically force their way into the global community of states. And you know what? It worked. By 1778, France signed a Treaty of Alliance, instantly turning a localized colonial rebellion into a massive global war. So the Americans got their alliance. But what did that actually mean for the rest of the world? Let's zoom out a bit for Section 2, the British and French fallout. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer mind-boggling cost of this alliance. Just look at that staggering figure, 1.3 billion livres. France's direct help was absolutely decisive for the American victory. They were secretly shipping gunpowder early on, and then, of course, they eventually sent their entire navy and troops. But to pull this off, France spent 1.3 billion livres. And the French government financed this almost entirely through loans, which just absolutely ballooned their national debt. The complete failure to control this massive spending, mixed with a totally unstable tax system, basically plunged the French state into financial ruin. Ironically, by helping to fund a revolution across the Atlantic, the French monarchy completely bankrupted itself. And that, of course, triggered their own devastating revolution just a few short years later. Let's cross over the English Channel and see how this all builds up. Now, you'd probably think losing the American colonies would be a completely devastating blow to Great Britain, right? But the historical data actually shows a really surprising reconfiguration. To fight the Americans, the French, the Spanish, and the Dutch, all at exactly the same time, Britain had to militarize like crazy. They ended up mobilizing roughly 1 in 8 adult males. And this massive, shared military struggle actually unified all these previously fractured local identities. The Scottish, the Welsh, the English. It forced them into a much more cohesive British national identity. Because they were fighting this gigantic coalition of global enemies, they managed to frame the loss of the colonies not as some humiliating defeat to a bunch of farmers, but as a moral victory. It was this narrative of a beleaguered nation standing totally alone against the entire world. So wildly enough, losing America actually helped forge the modern British identity. Moving right along to Section 3, the constitutional contagion. So, while the old empires were completely transforming, this brand new piece of political technology was spreading like wildfire. It sparked what scholars actually call a contagion of popular sovereignty. The American Revolution basically proved in real time that a nation could successfully design its very own government using a single written document. After the U.S. ratified its constitution in 1787, this massive global wave was unleashed. Just look at the timeline. 4 years later, in 1791, Poland adopts its first written constitution. France drafts theirs right in the middle of their own revolution that same year. And by 1805, Haiti ratifies its constitution following a highly successful revolt against French colonial rule. The blueprint of 1776 was literally cascading across the globe, fundamentally rewriting how human societies govern themselves. Now we have to look at Section 4, the paradox of liberty. As we dig deeper, there is a very stark paradox right at the heart of this entire era. On one hand, the United States was founded on this sweeping rhetoric of universal liberty, right? The self-evident truth that all men are created equal. But on the exact same hand, the brand new nation relied incredibly heavily on the rapidly expanding institution of chattel slavery. This wasn't just some minor background contradiction. It was absolutely built into the very core of the country's political and economic systems from day one. To really understand just how deeply entrenched this was, we have to look at this number, $2 billion. By 1860, the roughly 4 million enslaved people living in the United States were valued at $2 billion. To put that into perspective, that equates to trillions in today's money. Actually, except for real estate, enslaved human beings were literally the most valuable property in the entire country. They were worth more than all the railroads and all the banks combined. They were the absolute economic cornerstone, producing all the cotton, the tobacco, and the sugar that completely fueled the early American economy. And the primary author of the Declaration himself personally embodied this brand new nation's great paradox. At the exact same time Thomas Jefferson was drafting those famous words, "All men are created equal," he personally owned approximately 150 enslaved people. The entire political system of the antebellum period was just completely dominated by slaveholders, going all the way from the presidency right up to the Supreme Court. So this grand narrative of universal liberty was fundamentally at odds with the everyday reality of millions of enslaved individuals. And it was exactly this tension that would eventually, unavoidably, tear the nation apart in the Civil War. Which brings us to Section 5, from solidarity to imperialism. Now, this internal paradox between the high ideals of liberty and the hard realities of power eventually fueled a massive shift in U.S. foreign policy, and this brilliantly illustrates exactly how that happened. Back in the 1810s and 1820s, when Latin American colonies were fighting for their own independence from Spain, commentators in the U.S. absolutely celebrated them. They openly called them their Southern brethren. They saw these movements as a direct, natural continuation of the spirit of 1776. But jump forward a bit to 1846, and the narrative has dramatically changed. To justify territorial expansion, the U.S. invaded the independent Mexican Republic, ultimately acquiring roughly half of Mexico's entire territory. So the rhetoric completely shifted. It went from a shared pan-American Republican solidarity straight to a narrative of U.S. exceptionalism that actively justified imperial expansion and military intervention. The revolutionary blueprint was now effectively being used to validate building an empire. Let's wrap things up with Section 6, a fading global blueprint. This all brings us to the modern echo of these historical events. What actually is the ultimate legacy of the American constitutional model today? Well, a really sweeping study by the University of Virginia analyzed hundreds of global constitutions, and they found something just absolutely fascinating. The global average for constitutional revision is 38% annually. In fact, the average global constitution is completely replaced every 19 years. And ironically, Thomas Jefferson himself actually suggested that constitutions should expire every 19 years, so every single generation could craft its own. But contrast that with the United States today. Its chance of revision is near zero. I mean, it's been amended only once in the past 50 years. So the crucial point is that while the U.S. Constitution totally launched this global wave of democracy, its specific contents have actually fallen way out of sync with modern international consensus. For example, while the U.S. heavily protects the right to bear arms, only about 2% of the world's written constitutions do the same thing today. Conversely, a massive majority of global constitutions right now explicitly protect things like the right to health, or they have really strong constitutional protections for women, both of which are totally absent from the U.S. text. The U.S. model, which was once the absolute gold standard for the world, is honestly now playing a much more peripheral role in global constitution making. I want to leave you all with this really powerful thought from the researchers of that University of Virginia study. They wrote, "No evolutionary process favors a species that is frozen in time." The events of 1776 created this massive, undeniable ripple effect. It birthed a modern world of states, it unified rival empires, and it ignited a literal global contagion of written constitutions. But as the rest of the world continues to rapidly rewrite and update its democratic blueprints, we're kind of left to wonder, aren't we? Has the original American experiment stopped evolving? It is a genuinely fascinating question to consider as we look back on the true, complex legacy of the American Revolution. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and hey, keep questioning the history you think you know.